Welcome back, AP. All right. So, good to see you. I know that I haven't seen some of y'all in quite some time because y'all are on that green and white trip today. But sending this link out, making sure that you know that there is a short flip tonight. We're talking about like the scientific revolution's effects on society, right? Talking about some misconceptions between different faiths and their pro or con, I guess, pro or con. Their pro or antagonistic view of science and things like that. But last night we left off talking about this guy, Gottfried Leibniz, his accusations of Newton's like demonic science, taking God out of science and things like that. Probably just because he was salty because Newton beat him to shop when it came to calculus, right? So, but getting into it though, we got to talk about the effects on society, and then we're going to talk about a couple of other fields, right? We're going to talk about things like Robert Boyle, for example, and talk about like his ideas on volume and density and things like that. But let's get into it. What the? Oh, yeah, sorry. Biggest things about the effects on society is first and foremost that the growth of the scientific community is going to do a lot of different things, right? It's going to mainly affect the fact that it's going to grow other fields in academia particularly, other than theology, right? So if you look back at the Middle Ages and the earliest births of the university system in Europe, it was a Muslim-centered idea, the ideas of a university system, something borrowed from the North African and Southern Spain Islamic communities that actually grew and flowered out of their ideas to focus on different ideas, different subsets of academia and things like that. But as they began to grow in Europe, they actually grew out of Gothic cathedrals, right? These large Gothic cathedrals would eventually be turned into monasteries, convents, later on universities. You usually went to school to study one of three things, right? Medical science, which as we know at this point wasn't even really all that sciencey, lawmaking, lawyers or lawmaking, and the last one was theology, which was considered the most legitimate field out of all of them, right? Just like we talked about how astrology was more legitimate than astronomy in class, well, getting into the 1600s in Europe, theology was more legitimate than actual like empirical, experimental method science, right? But this revolution is going to change all that, right? In the upper brow fields of things, right? In the higher end societal fields, theology is going to take a little bit of a hit and it's going to step down a little. Now, governments also are going to become involved, and they're going to begin to fund projects linking the outcomes with the state, right? For example, national science academies were founded in several, like by 1660, the National Science Academy of London was founded. By 1690, I think, the National Science Academy of Paris was founded. There was one in Berlin, in Germany, or in the Holy Roman Empire still. Actually, by 1700. So you've got governments directly funding projects to help in their future efforts, right? Which is a very, very important concept. One thing, however, though, it's going to kind of like, sorry, Laura, it's going to push back women from the scientific community, right? Empirical and scientific observation kind of hindered the appropriation of women in academia, because people began to actually use studies to try and prove that like the genders and the sexes are actually very, very different. All the way up until 1911 in Paris, France. In 1911, Madame Curie, one of the biggest and most, like the largest and most influential proponents of science in all of academia ever, was actually told she wasn't allowed to join the community because she was a woman, right? So women are going to be barred from like scientific groups and discussions and things like that. Also, here's the big thing. When everybody imagines the scientific revolution, they imagine the effects that it had on the economy and living standards. Like, for example, Newton comes out with the universal law of gravitational force, and then the rest of the world goes, oh my God, this is crazy. It's just going to change everything, right? Like, so it didn't really. It was a very slow progression. I would argue as a historian that it really didn't even take effect until the late 1700s, going into the 1800s Industrial Revolution, right? Particularly that of the early 1800s, late 1700s, when it comes to like manufacturing, like the making of iron and steel and pig iron and things like that. That's when the scientific revolution kind of hit everybody else, right? But that also brought around the consumer. We'll talk about that stuff over break. But anyway, here's the other big thing. The debate between religion and science also began. So something that you need to understand really, really quickly before we go any further is, of course, the fact that you've got two major religious sects in Europe at this time, right? You've got Protestant, and then you have Catholic, okay? So with the Protestant and Catholic faiths, you got to discuss for a moment, like, which of these two is going to fund and promote scientific expansion, right? Now, getting into the Reformation and following the counter-ref Catholics church, right? The Counter-Reformation Catholic Church is going to seek to get back to its original doctrine, right? So you're going to see a very, very big antagonistic view of science, right? They're going to be very antagonistic of science, whereas the Protestant community is going to be a huge proponent of scientific advancement, right? Proponent of advancement, right? However, let's discuss something really quickly. This mainly has brought about this idea of this, what a lot of people call like the Copernican Catholic misconception, right? The idea that the Catholic Church thought that Copernicus's ideas were outlandish and dumb, right? That's not necessarily true. Many historians have argued that they believe that Urban VIII actually believed Galileo and believed that the universe was set up in the ways that he was claiming, just due to the fact that the Counter-Reformation happened following out of the late 1500s, that they couldn't necessarily endorse what would be considered like a new or different idea, because because the political times were just so tumultuous. Everything was so shook up, right? So the thing about it is they didn't consider these things necessarily heathen. Some people believe that they just believe that that the Catholic community couldn't handle it quite yet, right? So, however, it is going to affect certain aspects of life, like different daily occupations are going to change. Math also, one thing I need you to add to this whole thing, the ideas of mathematics are going to be integrated into society. This is huge, okay? So mathematics are going to be integrated into society in things like construction. For example, this surveying log from 1660, right? So construction, civic planning, right? Like ideas of the scientific revolution are actually going to eke their way into society going into the 1600s, but particularly, really quickly, what two classes do you think were affected, right? We've got the upper class, which is like your nobles, right? Your nobility. And then you've got maybe your well-educated, right? So, because here's the thing, surveyors during this time period were not like coming from carding guild families or anything like that. But the guilds are going to begin to take hold of these things, and it's going to advance their lives economically speaking. However, your poorest of the poor, your lowest ends of society, are still going to remain highly unaffected by the scientific revolution, right? So, but going into it a little bit more, there are several other fields that were also legitimized and began to grow from the scientific revolution itself. When you talk about the scientific revolution, you got to kind of hop around a little bit, right? Because when we talked about it, we went like Copernicus, and then we went to Brahe, and then we went to Kepler, right? And then we went to Galileo, and then we went to Newton, or Descartes in there somewhere. All right, so now, anyway, we moved in a forward progression, particularly discussing the setup of the universe, right? Well, there were other scientific fields going on at the same time that all this other stuff was going on as well, right? You've got people like you've got people like Andreas Vesalius, right? So let's talk about medicine and the body really quick, right? There's a huge, very important person that was doing this in the 1540s along with these other individuals, right? So going back to the perspective on the body, the Greek perspective on the body from the philosopher Galen, which is actually a very interesting one, he proposed, again, he's like the Aristotle of medicine. Good intention, just kind of a little off, right? Galen actually proposed that there are 4 different liquids in the body, right? 4 parts of the body. You got blood, phlegm, right? Black bile and yellow bile, right? These 4 fluids had to be in balance, and when they were out in balance, it caused things like illness and different concepts like that, which explains the proto-medical idea of bloodletting and the imbalance of one area, right? It kind of gives it kind of gives explanation to things like leeching, bloodletting, these ridiculous surgeries that killed Charles II, right? Well, then you've got a man that's going to come around, and he's actually going to begin to take cadavers, and he's going to open them up to try and really fully understand something that like Leonardo da Vinci started in the 1450s, right? And his name was Andreas Vesalius, right? Andreas Vesalius is going to literally cut up and carve up tons and tons and tons of different human bodies. I'll show you some other pictures of this stuff on, on Thursday. Is it Thursday? Yeah, after we do our little quiz. Don't forget, we have a quiz tomorrow, all right? We have a quiz on just the scientific revolution, guys. In an email I'll send out to everybody with this link in it. I'll tell you who's going to be on it, all right? So, mapped out the human body via autopsies, right? His book was called On the Structure of the Human Body, right? It's actually written in Latin. It's, I think it's just as important as Day Rib, but nobody gives it any credit. Now, he's going to publish that thing the same year as Copernicus's major works are going to come out, right? Some of the neatest things about it is he would literally meticulously peel back layers upon layers upon layers of skin. One of his copies of this is actually at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, right? Very cool thing about it as well is one of his very original copies of On the Structure of the Human Body. It's Fabrica de Humanum. Hold on, let me see if I can find it actually. I used to have this thing sitting around. De Humani Corporis Fabrica, On the Structure of the Human Body, right? Now, the crazy part about it, though, is they're all, like, lithographed as well. They all have pictures as medical textbooks and things like that. Shows the structure of the human skeleton. One of the coolest things about it, though, is one of the very, very first copies of that book was actually bound in human skin. All right, but it's such a cool thing. So there's one where he actually, if you can find it, you can go, like, look it up on Google. He had a human body because he wanted to, like, see it stood up. He had a human body that actually had rope threaded through, and it was, like, literally perched up like that. And he was, as he was, like, cutting up and, like, discovering these different parts of the body. Now, then you've got, wait, who is that? Nah, I don't know, who cares. All right, so now, then you've got people coming in like William Harvey, all right? You need to write down William Harvey really quick. William Harvey was kind of the proponent, the biggest proponent underneath. He did map the circulatory system and explain how the heart worked, but he also is kind of the first advocate for being general physician, right? For being a just regular day-to-day doctor. The ideas of infection, right? The ideas of inflammation, William Harvey is actually going to pioneer as well, and he is an English scientist, okay? So make sure you put like general physician work as well, but he is going to map the circulatory system and explain how the heart actually moves blood throughout the body. So these two guys are very influential in medicine. Then you've got the chemistry end of things and also the scientific end of things as well. You've got guys like Hooke and Leeuwenhoek. We talked about these guys in class, so we're going to end right here, and then I'm going to talk about Robert Boyle a little bit tomorrow. Don't let me forget. Now, Hooke and Leeuwenhoek, their biggest contributions are going to be the early microscopes and the debate over whose came first, right? Now, this was a Leeuwenhoek microscope, which just had a piece of glass on like a metal slide, and then the Hooke microscope, which I don't have a picture of right now, is a complex, like, multi-lens microscope. It's kind of like the original telescope to Galileo's, right? The Hooke one was just much more advanced, where he looked at cork cells and insects and would actually draw them with phenomenal accuracy. Leeuwenhoek, on the other hand, would actually look at, we talked about in class, other stuff on this one, and actually look at more pond scum and things like that, looking at, like, microorganisms and stuff. So that as well is going to be a massive leap forward, okay? Now, let's just talk about them really quick right now, all right? So let's talk about them real fast, just so we don't have to worry about them anymore. Then you've got one last guy who actually was like a mortal enemy of Newton, right? You've got Robert Boyle, who is going to become the father of modern chemistry. All right, he becomes the father of modern chemistry. I think you can't really see that. Here we go. Father of modern chemistry, right? Robert Boyle. He is an Irishman, all right? Irish scientist. And the big thing about, I'm pretty sure he's Irish. The big thing about him is he's actually going to discuss the nature of chemical reactions and how these different chemicals actually come together. His biggest contribution to society, though, was his vacuum chamber, right? So he actually created a vacuum chamber where he could actually show that the necessity of gases with the inside of the volume of gases is that. Okay, so let me get into it. It's called Boyle's Law. Boyle's Law states that the gases inside of a container or the pressure of a gas varies directly with the volume, right? So the pressure of inside, like so, just look up Boyle's Law and just jot down the little snippet of it, okay? But he also comes up with Boyle's Law. He at one point actually apparently took like a cockatoo and shoved it inside of the gas chamber to see like how that would affect it. But he was a very big fan of pumping air out of his air chamber and showing how like a feather will fall like a rock without wind resistance or any type of air resistance whatsoever. So those are all of our scientific rev guys. Wow, y'all banged out the scientific revolution in 4 days. That's insane. Never been able to do that with a class before. But we'll get into these guys a little bit more tomorrow. We'll probably open up the Enlightenment a little bit tomorrow as well. And yeah, so to say the least, fervently impressed. But I will see you guys then. Y'all have a good evening.